All right, thank you very much. Welcome back to Track One. Next presenter is Matt McCrae. Matt is currently a climate policy analyst with Our Children's Trust. He was formerly with the City of Eugene, where he managed the first community climate and energy action plan for that city. Matt?
Great, thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks for organizing. I know it's a huge lift to put all this together and get everybody here, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you all for taking your time out of your Monday to be here. A couple people I want to introduce really quickly because I think we'll probably go through the time fairly quickly. But Ethan Nelson is in the back, if you just raise your hand. He is working with the City of Eugene, and our mayor, Mayor Kitty Piercy, is here as well. So you all know Mayor Piercy will be speaking later, but I just wanted to point them both out because they can potentially answer some of your questions as well. My aim is to go through the material that I have in about 15 minutes and leave the last 15 minutes for questions. But I'm also going to stick around through lunch, and I'll be here as long as people have questions. I know for those of you who were here for that previous session with Michelle Cribben, there were a lot of questions, great questions, by the way. You're all clearly thinking hard about this, and glad that we can share what we know to help move Bend forward. So really briefly, congratulations, you are joining a huge and growing list of cities that have set greenhouse gas targets. So you're not alone. The list is long, and I'm not going to belabor that point, but just to say you're in good company. So here's where I'm headed. I'm going to talk really briefly about lessons learned, and then I'm going to speak about prioritizing climate actions, and then I'm going to hopefully bust a few myths for you. Because I only have 15 minutes to present, this is going to be more of like the greatest hits and less of the story that you got from Michelle. But hopefully it's useful. So a few things about lessons learned from our implementation over the last several years, and when I say our, I mean the City of Eugene. And many of these things already within the Bend ordinance, which is fantastic, which is that we set Bend set a baseline greenhouse gas inventory, which is going to be crucial to understanding, okay, where are we going to focus and where are we going to focus our efforts first. Tracking progress over time is also required within the ordinance. So, and it's crucial that you be tracking progress, changes in energy use and emissions, and that you're reporting that progress back to the community. That's one of the ways that it's easiest for people to keep track and understand what's happening and what's not happening so that they can know how to be effective. So congratulations to you for putting all that right front and center at the very get-go. I was going to say it's important, and you've done it already. Also, the importance of champions. As I mentioned, our mayor is here and an important champion for the City of Eugene. No doubt you've got champions as well. A few things about champions is that it's important that you have more than one or two. So to the extent that you can broaden that group of champions who are spokespeople for your effort, that's going to be really important. So it's not only diversity, but people who are well-spoken and well-respected within the community. You probably know this already, but I won't beat that point up. But there's a great example from Al Sharpton and Pat Robertson for an ad for We Can Solve It. I don't know if this link's going to work. We'll try it. And if it doesn't, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Maybe it will. Have you all seen this? Yeah, audio's not going to work for me. I'm sorry. Anyway, these two sitting on a couch in front of the ocean, talking about how they have a lot of differences, but they both feel very strongly that we need to take care of addressing climate change. And so the point being that when we can put two champions from very different worlds together, speaking about the value of doing something like this, it goes a long way. So encourage you just to think about, again, the diversity of the people you have, spokespeople and champions for your effort. And don't forget that some of those people may be younger than you. There's a tremendous value in younger people who have many times the most at stake, speaking and sharing their viewpoint. And I think Mayor Piercy will speak to that as well. But don't forget that those people have tremendous power in using their words as well. Another lesson learned, and this is from our work in Eugene, is that this is all about partnerships, right? The City of Bend is not going to be able to dramatically drive down emissions in Bend without a ton of other partners working and playing along and collaborating. So there's a lot of work to be done, but there are a lot of players who have roles. So just keep that in mind, that this isn't just the City of Bend doing this, this is a community goal. So quickly on to prioritizing actions. I'm just going to hit a few things that we've used to make sure that as we're prioritizing actions, we're able to get the most out of our work. It's important to prioritize the areas where the city has the greatest influence. So this is a greenhouse gas inventory from the state of Oregon. It's the best proxy I have for Bend right now. And this blue section on the right-hand side is transportation. So it's emissions associated with transportation. It's about 39% statewide. And I just want to make the point that when you're thinking about the actions that Bend is likely to take, there are a number of things you're going to do. Perhaps addressing emissions from landfill and addressing emissions from buildings as well, right? But for example, the City of Bend doesn't have a lot of influence on the building code. The building code that you use here is the state building code. And so the City of Bend can lobby for a change in building code, but you're not likely to really affect, dramatically that building code. That's done at the state level. It doesn't mean you don't try and work on that, but my point here is to focus on the things where you have the most control. And the City of Bend plans, designs, constructs, and maintains your transportation system, right? And so it's important just to keep that in mind, that this is probably, when you look at the entirety of all the emissions associated with Bend, transportation and land use decisions, right? Where and where we put different homes and buildings and businesses, that's the place where Bend, the City of Bend, is going to have probably the largest influence on your emissions. Another just quick aside here. This is also a place where there's a ton of savings to be had. So I'm going to use Eugene as an example because I know the numbers. In Eugene, we spend a pretty significant amount of money on gasoline and diesel fuel within our community. Guesses on how much money we spend each year on gas and diesel in Eugene?
2.7 billion.
2.7 billion. That would be amazing. It's a pretty sizable sum, though. It's about $170 million every year. $170 million.
The city of Eugene?
That's not the city entity. That's as a community on gasoline and diesel. Right, and so I'm going to bring your attention to this chart here because when you look at the price of a gallon of gas or diesel, we spend some 45% on crude oil, which Eugene makes exactly zero of. 18% on refining, which Eugene does exactly zero of. There's some distributing and marketing that happens in Eugene and taxes certainly that affect Eugene, but the vast majority of that dollar is immediately exported out of our community, right? Gone forever. So if we're spending $170 million, at least $100 million, maybe $120 million are gone every year, right? So this is a place, when you think about transportation, the dollars you're spending on surface transportation, there are a huge amount of dollars that are exiting your community that can be recaptured by setting up your transportation system differently. So prioritizing actions, I'd encourage you all to think about focusing on the actions that save money. It's just going to be the easiest sell at the outset. It doesn't mean that we stop with only the actions that save money. But as a starting place, I am quite certain there are stacks of them, because we've done this for Eugene, stacks of actions that save money. And it's a no-brainer. We can all agree that that's the place to go. And you'll hit a point later down the road, maybe it's 10, 15 years down the road, where, okay, now everything that we're going to do is going to cost some amount of money. But at the outset, it's all saving money. So I use the example of us in Eugene. We just replaced a huge number, about half of our street lights. And yes, the upfront costs, there was cost there. But over the course of 10 years, we're saving about $100,000 over about 10 years. So there's savings to be here. So my point here too is that you have to focus on, sorry, going the wrong way, on life cycle emissions and life cycle costs, right? That we're not just looking at what's the upfront cost of doing this climate action. We're looking at the cost and the savings of taking the action over the full time period of that particular action. I'm not going to belabor that. I'm going to keep moving. So, boy, sorry, this is sensitive. Also encourage you to think about where are you spending money already. This is Eugene's capital improvement program. You have one for Bend already, or as well. You have planned investments. Think about how those planned investments can support climate action. So one of the questions that came in the last session was, how much does it cost for the city of Portland to do this climate work? And I would make the argument, and I think Michelle was making the same argument, you're making climate policy already. You're already making decisions that influence greenhouse gas emissions at the community scale. You're just not calling it that, right? If you're thinking about what we're going to do for our streetlights, how are we going to replace them over time, it's got a huge impact on the electricity usage. And so you're already making a policy, you're already making decisions about your investments. It's just that the greenhouse gas impact isn't super clear necessarily, right? Unless we're asking ourselves. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in another slide here. Thinking about places where you're already building roads, for example, or reconstructing roads, right? There's the opportunity to change the way those roads function, if that's a place where that road function needs to change. Think about the places where that investment's already happening, as opposed to saying, hey, let's go dramatically change these intersections that we're not planning to touch anyway. Go to the intersections where you're working already. That's the place where it's an incremental lift, right? The extra cost is small compared to the overall change. Another way to think about this, when we think about internal emissions within the city entity, one of the things that we've done in Eugene is that we've started to use a warm mix asphalt. So it's fairly intuitive, I think, that if you heat the asphalt up to a lower temperature instead of a higher temperature, it takes less energy, right? So it's actually a lower greenhouse gas emission product, and it works just as well. So we've just changed our practices. This is not a whole new set of practices or new things that we have to do. It's just incorporating a different way of doing the work we're already doing, saving ourselves money at the same time because we're using more recycled material within our asphalt, and we're heating it to a lower temperature so it costs less energy. And at the same time, so this is, you can kind of see the emissions coming off of that truck there. That's from heating up the asphalt product to really high temperatures. It's really nasty if you've ever been around that, right? And a lower temperature version has way fewer fumes, so it's healthier for the people that are working around it as well. So another thing to think about is that a ton of these things that we're talking about, and Michelle spoke to this as well, there are a ton of co-benefits. There are a lot of other reasons to do these same actions. In this case, health benefits, cost savings, there are many. And lastly, as far as thinking about where you're already spending money, you're already replacing your vehicle fleet, right? The city of Bend is buying police patrol vehicles all the time. So it's not a new action that we're going to go buy all these new vehicles. We're already doing that. It's just thinking differently about, okay, what vehicles are we going to buy? What's the most important criteria for picking a new police vehicle? We just changed our vehicles. I know it sounds like a Ford advertisement, I'm sorry. We just changed our vehicles to this model, and we're saving about a third of the fuel every year. Once we've totally changed out the vehicles, we'll be saving about $200,000 every year on fuel for police vehicles. So when somebody's asking how much it's going to cost, you can say, well, let me tell you how much it's going to save, right? I mean, there's seriously, especially on the front end, there is so much money to be saved here. All right, so lastly, the triple bottom line. And again, this comes back to the point, you're already making decisions about climate change, about carbon emissions associated with your community, just not necessarily calling them that yet. But one of the things that we have started to do in Eugene is triple bottom line assessments, where we ask ourselves questions about policy decisions that are going to be made. What are the impacts on people, on our society? What are the impacts of this decision on the economics of our local economy and prosperity, right? And what are the impacts on the planet? And so we try to put forward, when we're giving a decision to council, we frequently put forward a triple bottom line assessment that says, these are the impacts that are associated with this decision that you, council, are about to make. And we're just making it super clear for the councilors who are juggling a whole bunch of different questions. What are the trade-offs in this decision they're making? We're trying to make it very transparent. And one of the questions about the planet side is, what are the greenhouse gas impacts? And so if you wanted to do a super stripped down version of this, just looking at climate change. I don't recommend that that's necessarily the best way to go, but one could just ask the question, what are the greenhouse gas impacts of every decision that goes in front of council? They're making the decisions already, and I guarantee you that 90% of the decisions that your council is making have greenhouse gas implications that are fairly straightforward to figure out. And finally, when we do triple bottom line work in Eugene, we of course do it with the help of our local businesses. This is Oakshire. They brewed a triple bottom line Belgian pale for us. You know you're in Oregon when, right? All right. Lastly, when you're thinking about prioritizing actions, think about those that just simply can't be done later, right? So when you're making huge multi-million-dollar investments, that's a place for us to think really hard about what are the implications of this. Another one is when you're thinking about putting trees in the ground, you can't buy a 30-year-old tree. The only way to get there is by planting one today and waiting 30 years, right? So when you think about prioritizing actions, think about those things you just simply can't do later. And I'm not suggesting that we're going to solve this crisis by planting trees, but just to think about, the implications and where's the opportunity, right? Think about the ability to do an action later down the road. So lastly, a few myths, and then a few minutes for Q&A here. Myth number one that I want to just break for you, that most people in Central Oregon aren't interested in addressing climate change. Because you're probably all thinking, well, I live in Bend, not everybody here is on board. You know what? Actually, most of the people in Central Oregon are on board. This comes from the Oregon Values and Beliefs Project. It's available at OregonValuesProject.org, and I'll stick around and give you more of that if you need it. This is a survey that was done a couple years ago. It's a statistically valid survey done by phone across all of Oregonians, but they did a big enough number that you could pull out just Central Oregon and still statistically valid. So these questions are from this survey. So this is the answers, the people that answered affirmatively to these questions. Climate change requires us to change our way of life, such as driving less or living more simply. So the percentage of Central Oregon residents who said, yeah, that's true, was about 64%. Right, the next one, if climate change becomes a problem, we can deal with it later. And the people who agree with that statement, 28%. Right? So exactly, you're all in better company than maybe you think. It's just Oregonians overall are certainly supportive of climate action. There should be a stronger government policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Central Oregon respondents, 54% agreed with that, and 12% who felt neutral. Right? So you're already over the cusp. People in Central Oregon are ready for this. It's just that we don't necessarily all recognize it. And lastly, people who agree that we should establish a carbon emission tax to discourage greenhouse gas emissions and use the revenue to invest in green jobs and technologies. Percent who agree, 51%, and 16% who feel neutral. So the public opinion is already going that way. I encourage you to take a look at the Oregon Values Project. Some of the survey results in these specific questions are buried deep in the weeds. If you have a hard time finding them, I'm happy to help point you towards those through email conversation if that's easy. All right, so myth number two, that it's impossible to make the types of emissions reductions that we're talking about. It's completely possible. So these are Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see that they've been headed down since about 2008 at a couple percent per year. So emissions reductions are possible. If you were here for Portland's discussion, you saw the rate of emissions reductions that they're achieving, which are really remarkable. It can be done, and people aren't living in caves, right? So this is a quick example from Eugene, and I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. 2000 on the left, 2013 on the right, and the green line is total electricity use, the red line is total gasoline and diesel use, and the blue line is total natural gas use. This is all in Eugene. And just for comparison here, this is 2008, so we think about the economic downturn and the influence there. Certainly, economic downturn has had an influence on our energy use, but these trends started before and continued after 2008, right? It's not that we just went off a cliff at 2008. These trends are fairly long-term, on the order of 10 years. And then just to focus in on one area where I can give you kind consistent comparisons here, I've narrowed into that white stretch there, which is 2006 to 2012. And here's the punchline from this. The electricity use in EWEB's, our local service territory, went down 11.5%. Gasoline and diesel use went down 13%. Again, this is just 6 years. Natural gas use went down 12.5%, and our population went up 7.5% over that same time period. So the levels of reductions can be done. What you're talking about, what Bend is setting out to do, it can be done. All right, and last myth here is about our largest source of emissions. And I'm just going to jump right through it because I want to leave some time for Q&A here. We talk a lot about the energy we use in buildings. We talk a lot about transportation-related emissions, which are significant. I'm not suggesting we don't pay attention to those. We have to pay attention to those. But there's a big piece of the pie that we don't very frequently talk about, and I just want to bring your attention to it. So this is from Metro, the metro area in Portland, and when I've seen other greenhouse gas inventories done this way, it stands pretty well for most of the country. EPA did one nationwide, but it's not nearly as clear to look at, which is why I'm using this one. So about 27% of emissions associated with energy in buildings, about 25% associated with transportation. And when you look at the emissions that are associated with industry and commercial uses, right, really what we're talking about is the materials, the goods and food that we consume on a regular basis, right? The energy that went into making this microphone and making this screen, thank you. All the energy that goes into the materials we consume is a huge source of emissions, and especially when we look at the emissions that we're importing from things that are made overseas, it's a growing source of emissions. I'm not suggesting that the city of Bend in particular is going to have a ton of influence on this, though there are ways that our local governments do influence these emissions, but it's just something that I want you to make sure that we're paying attention to, right? Because if we're not paying attention to those consumption-related emissions, we're missing the boat. So that's all I have in prepared remarks, and the rest of the time we'll leave for questions. And I know we're not going to get through necessarily all the questions that are here, so as I mentioned, I'll stay here through the break and as long as people have questions for me. So do we have questions?
We have time for 2 questions
All right.
before lunch.
So we'll start back here.
One of the survey questions showed that a little more than half of folks agreed that government should take action. What we found here is they think it's federal government and it's not appropriate for local government.
Right.
Have you got any clever answer to that?
I guess I would say we're all making policies that affect emissions at every scale, right? So yes, it's federal government and it's state government and it's local government. There are too many decisions that are being made by a local government, as I mentioned, about how you build your roads, how you build your transportation system, where you put homes and businesses in proximity to each other and how dense they are. Those have huge implications for your local emissions, right? So it has to be local too.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
One of the city councilors who was opposed to the climate resolution we just passed basically was arguing, and I'm just wondering what your sense of this is in looking at the statistics and maybe talking about Eugene specifically, that really you could account for most of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because of the recession, and that overall economic activity went down, and that's really what drove it, and that there was some evidence that we're starting to see them go up again, and so kind of saying that the plans that you're seeing in Portland and by extension anywhere else are really dissociated from what's happened in the statistics.
Yeah, it's
What's
interesting.
your reaction and response?
Yeah, well, so I don't have that in my chart here, but I have charted the economic health of Eugene next to these reducing emissions, and they separate at about 2008. They start to go in different directions. If you saw Michelle Krim's presentation, she was showing the number of jobs going up over time, right, and as emissions are going down. I think the trend is long enough now that I think there's enough statistics in multiple different cities to start to refute that. We should talk more about what it would take to convince somebody that this isn't just all due to economic recession. Because nobody wants to get to our climate goals, achieve our climate goals through economic, right, hardship. That is not the plan here. If we're doing that, we're doing something wrong. So we just have maybe one more minute. in the back, and then I'll stay for other questions afterwards. Yeah, go
I'd
ahead.
like to open a philosophical question, and it has to do within Central Oregon, you particularly have a community that doesn't like the idea of losing freedom, and doesn't like the idea of regulation, and is very anti. So my question is, and I'm play acting a little bit here, you must have some people, either in Portland, if Michelle's still here, or Eugene, who react to the idea of the regulations, of the restrictions all this is going to place on me, and my loss of freedom. And I'd just like to,
Right.
for the folks that go to talk to those kind of people, what your thoughts would be.
That's a great, really, really great question. I'd say all of us appreciate the freedom that we have, and nobody likes regulation. I mean, overall, like, who wants to be regulated, right? And who wants less freedom? What I would say to that particular argument is that what we're trying to do here is provide opportunities for people that want to make a different choice, right? So if somebody wants to get around without using their vehicle, we want to make sure that they have a safe and efficient opportunity to do that, right? We don't want to require everybody, if they want to get around, to have to use a car. We want to give other options. It doesn't mean we're going to regulate people out of their cars. It means we're trying to provide the freedom of choice for the people who live in this community to get around in a low-carbon way if they so choose, right? And I think you could go similar, sector by sector. If you don't want to have your home retrofitted to save energy, by all means, you have the freedom to stay in an energy-sucking building. And we're going to offer some opportunities for people that want to insulate their homes so they can use less energy, right? So the freedom's there. I don't see any local community who's putting up big, harsh regulations to try and achieve these targets. It's just, I haven't seen it happen. Portland's example is maybe the closest, right? Where they're requiring deconstruction. That adds some cost. You know, that's different, but that's also the very front edge. I don't see other cities that are going that direction yet. So there are more other questions, and I know we're out of time. We're running into lunch here. I'm going to stick around, so as long as you have questions, please come on up and we can do that.